I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So welcome back, everyone. As is our custom here on this program, we have a diverse and well-rounded show for you right now. So Ben will kick us off with the latest sordid news from the John Durham probe. Igor Danchenko has been acquitted, much to all of our chagrin. Then I'm going to talk about kind of the impending 2022 midterm elections. From my perspective, it's starting to take shape a little bit. We'll see if the panel agrees with me. Then Emily's going to talk about John Oliver's trans monologue, and then Rachel will take us home, I should say, with the latest news from across the pond and the 44-day premiership collapse of Prime Minister Liz Truss. But let's kick it over to Ben to start us off with Igor Danchenko.
Yeah, I think the latest news from the seemingly wrapping up John Durham special counsel unites those on the left and right who likely both believe that the Durham special counsel was a dud for different reasons, naturally. And yeah, I think it's worth looking at this at a very high level before we jump into the specifics of the Danchenko case in terms of what the Durham prosecution has done and where it's going. So it's brought cases against 3 individuals to this point. One, all small fry relatively in the scope of the Russiagate/Spygate scandal. You had Kevin Clinesmith, an FBI attorney who doctored an email that was used to perpetrate a fraud on the FISA court and spy on the Trump campaign. He was charged for doctoring that email, but he got less than a slap on the wrist, basically. The second one was Michael Sussman, Clinton campaign lawyer, who essentially lied to the FBI in terms of who he was representing when he brought Trump, Russia, garbage, dirt to the FBI, and then a whole slew of other agencies as well. And as we know, a DC jury refused to convict him when he clearly lied about who he was representing when he brought that information. And that had material consequences, arguably, for the FBI and the government itself. Last but not least, then we have Igor Danchenko. Igor Danchenko, I guess, relatively was maybe the biggest fry of a series of small fries here, in that he was essentially the key source that built the garbage Steele dossier, which, though the press neglects this, omits it, and obfuscates on it, was the core document that underpinned the entire notion of Trump-Russia collusion, on which the effort to spy on Trump was based, and a whole series of investigations accelerated. That document, as we know, the FBI's top analyst on the case could never corroborate any of it. Danchenko was the one behind it. Danchenko lied about several things, allegedly, to the FBI in terms of who his sources were and the facts associated with it. And yet Danchenko himself was acquitted on several charges of giving false statements. What are the big takeaways here beyond the fact that it's notable that Durham went for these small fries and then essentially used these speaking documents to lay out that actually it wasn't these individuals who were really the most culpable actors in foisting a fraud on the American people, and one of the biggest scandals ever, but he actually used them as a window into the government's own malfeasance, misconduct, and negligence. Well, look, in the Danchenko trial, there were some interesting revelations, just like there were in other ones. For example, and a hat tip to Technofog, because he summarized many of these at his Substack. You know, the FBI obviously made Danchenko an informant after they knew he was a liar and paid him $200,000 to keep his mouth shut for about 3 years during the pendency of the various Trump-Russia investigations, also shielding him from scrutiny that would have shown the malfeasance of the FBI in continuing to pursue Trump-Russia. Also, the FBI offered his boss, Danchenko's boss, Christopher Steele, $1 million to corroborate aspects of the Steele dossier prior to the election. This is in October 2016. He turned them down. The FBI also covered its eyes and ears with respect to various aspects of Danchenko's past, including the fact they had opened up an espionage inquiry into him based upon his dealings with foreign agents, as well as what he came to apparently Brookings Institute's colleagues with about potentially spying on their behalf or brokering some sort of spy agreement. And then the Mueller special counsel itself covered its eyes and ears with respect to all sorts of defects around Danchenko. So look, many interesting revelations here, but I think the key point to make is that the government's posture, so-called the government's posture via Durham, has always been that it was the government that was duped. So in the Sussman case, one of the prosecutors there in the opening of the case said this, quote, "We are here because the FBI is our institution. It should not be used, that is manipulated, as a political tool for anyone, not Republicans, not Democrats, not anyone." Now, Durham, at the end of the Danchenko case, seemed to reflect some sort of growth in the government's posture. He said this, "The FBI failed here." That's point blank quote. "It mishandled the investigation, and agents didn't do what they should have done." He also opined that the FBI could have been simply incompetent, his words, or that it had been working in coordination, presumably with the Clinton campaign. Okay, he should know by now, after years of investigating this, whether it was incompetence, coordination and collusion, a conspiracy, and whether charges should have been brought against all of these government officials implicated in all of these filings that he's put forth for years. The fact that he isn't, I think, is a huge red flag, I think, about the credibility of the entire investigation. And it seems that it's going to culminate in some kind of report where hopefully he's put on record as to why he did not bring all these charges against government officials for foisting the greatest scandal on the American people that we've ever seen, with the national security apparatus spying on its political foe in all sorts of terrible ways and law-breaking and corrupt ways. So at the end of the day, I think the question of the Durham special counsel is this: was the fix in from the start, and he was essentially a captured element of the deep state, poised to investigate the deep state to provide cover because everyone knew how corrupt Russiagate/Spygate was, so this was all an optics exercise? Or did Durham do the best he could, given the fact that no one's going to win in trying to take on the House? You have juries that are essentially regime juries that will never convict all the regime actors, and the best he could do was expose the regime's corruption by proxy through these cases. Open to your thoughts on it, and then to what comes next. Are we going to have a church committee? Do we hear any Republicans talking about it? Love to hear your thoughts on all the takeaways associated with Durham.
So I think to one of your questions, is Durham an op? I mean, I think all these people are psyops, so the answer is always yes from my point of view. But I do think this raises an interesting question, because what we need out of all of this, right? The meta narrative of everything you're talking about is accountability. No one has been punished. No one has gone to jail. Even the FBI lawyer, who I cannot get over the fact that he lied to a FISA court and is just walking around and still a member of the bar in good standing. That just blows my mind. But I think this is the question for Republicans going forward. These investigations, these special counsel things are not working. So they have two choices. Oversight is one, and I think you'd have to have the level of a church committee investigation. And that doesn't require just saying it and signaling about it. It requires hiring a massive amount of talented staff to actually dig into this. It requires putting their back into it with resources. And I've heard a lot of rhetorical commitment to these things. I have not yet seen the commitment on ground level resourcing. But two, if anyone's going to go to jail, Congress is going to have to impeach people, right? Like, the special counsels aren't going to do it. There has to be I think at this point, the only people who can hold these types of criminals, right, if that's what they are, accountable, has to be Congress. Congress has to do the impeachment exercise. That's the only way I see actual accountability going through here.
Just really quickly, what I'll say is the difference between, and Rachel knows this, the difference between the church committee and now is the media, or one big difference between the era of the church committee and right now is that we now have a media that is essentially in bed with the left and with the Democratic Party and is basically a partisan advocacy apparatus. And so a church committee, I'm also so pessimistic about, because to me, it seems with the Danchenko trial wrapping up and the way that the entire Sussman, the entire Durham probe has been treated by the media, is that it's unserious and that this is sort of a big flop for the right, when in fact, actually, I think a lot of revelations did emerge as a result of this trial, as a result of the Sussman trial. We did learn a whole lot more information, and I think partially that was the goal. So to me, it's like, well, we can have a church committee, and then it just sort of goes out into the ether, unless you have a media that is willing to bring it to the public's attention and treat it seriously and as the grave sort of probe that it would be. And so, not to be, I don't know that I can out pessimist Rachel, but I feel like maybe I just did.
Can I just add one quick thing before we take to Josh? I think the January 6th committee has been a case study in how to do this, right? I hate everything the January 6th committee has done, but they did primetime hearings, right? They dragged people, they leaked like crazy. If this is how we're going to do things, if this is how we have to get in front of the public, I guess this is what we're doing now. Okay, sorry, that was it.
No, I'll be real quick. I mean, Ben, you're one of the foremost experts in the country from my perspective on all things Russiagate related. So I don't think any of the three of us, or really very few people out there in general, can kind of question, I think, your instincts on this. So, I mean, what I said in my Fox Business hit on this topic this week, which is partially informed by your insights, Ben, which I privately texted you beforehand. From my perspective, the fix did partially seem in. And I think what you're going to see from John Durham in his final report is basically say that we have reached the dead end, legally speaking, and the remedy has to happen politically speaking. And I guess as like a lawyer with a constitutional law specialty, the analogy that I make is the U.S. Supreme Court has a juridical doctrine referred to as the political question doctrine. There are some questions that kind of come up that are so inherently political by nature, and there was no such thing as a legal kind of Article 3 remedy. There's no such thing as a damage or an injunction or an estoppel or anything that the court can do. The remedy has to happen from the political branches. By way of crass analogy, I think that's basically more or less what John Durham's getting at here. If you look at his statements in the final days of the Danchenko trial. I mean, he said that, quote, the FBI mishandled the case. He said his special counsel team was not there to defend the FBI. He has been very, very critical, obviously properly, of the way that the FBI has handled this. So I think at this point, our best bet is to wait for that final report. To Rachel's point, obviously, then, what does Congress actually do with that report? I mean, I tend to agree that impeachment, which is kind of the quintessential political remedy. I mean, there is no political remedy kind of higher and more powerful and more awesome in the literal sense of the word awesome than the impeachment remedy. So if that's what this is ultimately getting at, then I guess that's kind of a cause for hope. That's a silver lining. Obviously, Republicans tend to talk a lot of big game, or they tend to talk a big game on this topic, and oftentimes there is very little in the way of results. But let's transition now. I guess it's actually kind of a natural transition, talking about how Republicans kind of talk a lot and then oftentimes don't actually follow through. So the midterm elections are coming up very soon. By the time this podcast comes out, we'll probably be about 2.5 weeks or so away, maybe even a little less than that. And, I guess my reading on this, I think back to kind of over the summer. So Joe Biden's approval rating hit rock bottom in the month of July. It was kind of like mid to late July. I think there was some polling, maybe Quinnipiac or Emerson had him polling around 31 to 33% job approval rating. And then it was a little odd. From late July to late August, the Democrats seemed to get a little wind at their back. I think some of us, firmly in kind of the pro-life Dobbs was correctly decided camp, perhaps at least at that time, had not properly anticipated the extent of at least the short-term emphasis on short-term blowback in the Dobbs case. We saw the very disappointing result in a red state like Kansas when there was a pro-life referendum to amend the Constitution to remove a so-called natural right to abortion from that state's Constitution. There were some special elections in Nebraska, Minnesota, and New York State that seemed to militate in Democrats' favor. And Biden's approval rating did slowly trickle up from kind of that historic July era low of 37 to kind of nestling in kind of the 41 to 43 range by the end of August. And then by the end of August, heading into Labor Day weekend in September, Biden had this galling, a horrific speech in Philadelphia that we have covered on this podcast before. And more generally speaking, it seems to me, and I'm not entirely sure what this is attributable to be honest with you, but it seems to me that kind of the median American kind of just went home to politics 101. And over the course of the past month and a half or so, the polling, I think, has clearly evinced that there are far more Americans right now who are willing and eager to vote on issues of economy, inflation, crime, maybe to a lesser extent, immigration, although even in some crosstabs, now immigration is actually polling as a more powerful issue at the ballot box for most voters than the abortion issue. So, earlier this week, there was a New York Times poll. The Republicans were up 4 points on the generic ballot, 49 to 45. And, a whopping 44% of voters, 44% said that economic related issues were their main driving force at the polls. I think it was like 28% cited the economy and another 16% or something like that cited inflation. So it seems like the Dobbs abortion backlash was incredibly short-lived. That's kind of why I think you see Joe Biden kind of getting up there trying to recapture this post-Dobbs magic by saying that his number one priority next term is going to be to quote-unquote codify Roe versus Wade, which everyone on the show knows is a genuinely extreme position, because they will take the so-called mental health exception and extend it to effectively legalize abortion for all 9 months of pregnancy, all nationwide. So I guess what I'm getting at this point, and far be it from me to kind of be the bearer of good news, but I'm starting to feel pretty good. I'm starting to feel like pretty optimistic that Republicans actually could win a lot of, potentially nearly all of, these toss-up races. So states like Nevada, Arizona, Georgia race has gotten a lot of headlines, of course, over the past couple of weeks with all of the woes from Herschel Walker. It seems to me like Brian Kemp could definitely pull Herschel Walker over the finish line there. I'm starting to think very similarly about Blake Masters in Arizona, with Carrie Lake starting to poll as well as she is polling versus her opponents there. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I'll just kind of throw it open on that note. I mean, like, do you guys kind of share my optimism for the Republican Party in the midterms at this point? And the related kind of corollary to that question is, if Republicans do actually retake the House and the Senate, to kind of go back to our last segment and the Durham probe and impeachment and all these subpoenas and everything, what should they do? I mean, what should the agenda actually be? Because I think, Kevin McCarthy's kind of 5 bullet point agenda, as we discussed on this program, is not particularly inspiring. But, I'll throw it open to you guys on that note.
I was going to say, actually, it's like some shameless self-promotion here of a piece which Rachel is quoted and coming out on what McCarthy might do and what maybe he should do more of come January if Republicans win. Now, on the question, one of the biggest problems here is how terrible our polling is. You have really close races in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Arizona, and we basically have not updated. The polling industry has had since 2016 to make dramatic changes, and now they're sort of still looking around and saying, "Why do we still suck?" Basically, why are we still failing so much to accurately gauge what's happening in these races? So, if I had to err on the side of the polls, I would err on them being underestimating Republican support in most of these races. And in most of these races, Republican support has increased over the course of the last month. And the races have tightened to the point where many of them, Pennsylvania, for instance, are probably within the margins of error. So I think, it has been as the economy, gas prices have gone back up again since the summer, and abortion has sort of faded to the background, no matter how much Democrats keep trying to run on it. Inflation only feels like it's getting worse to the average consumer. The consumer price index is up an incredible amount of money. That is what people are voting on right now. And that isn't to say the culture war issues aren't salient, because they absolutely are, but salient to the point where, as Republicans can neutralize the Democratic attacks on abortion as they have by saying, okay, well, what restrictions does Mark Kelly support? What restrictions does John Fetterman support? What restrictions does the President of the United States support? And when they answer nothing, you get, like that viral video of the Washington Post, the Washington Post interview of a girl in Pennsylvania. I think she was at a Steelers game saying, well, I think Democrats are way too extreme on this issue. And they're the ones that are sort of out there, and I trust Republicans on the economy. So I think Josh's instincts are completely correct on this, but the polling is very frustrating.
Yeah, and shameless plug for Real Clear, which is engaging in a new initiative to track the pollsters and basically, do postmortems after every single election. So I think we've all probably baked into all the polls that we see the fact that there aren't representative samples of voters, and then you have the shy, I guess, pseudo-fascist, semi-fascist voter out there at this point, and obviously that skews the polls. But I do think, beyond the movement that we've seen in terms of the generic Republican versus Democrat, and then what we've seen in some of the battleground races, some other bullish data points that we can look to are the shrinking gap in terms of the New York gubernatorial race, which I think on the merits it should be a slam dunk for a Republican, but obviously not based upon what the constituents are like in the state of New York, although obviously different outside New York City proper than in New York City proper, which is outsized. But there's been a serious shrinking in the polls there. And it's close in part because I think the Republican candidate, Lee Zeldin, literally the theory of the case has proven out in his own life when there's been an effort to assault him. And then there was a shooting right outside his house with the perps hiding underneath, I think, the porch of his house in the run up to the election. I mean, it can't get any more blatant than that in terms of the out of control nature of crime in the state. In Rhode Island, there's a Republican who's actually seriously competing for a House seat. And then even in Connecticut, Dick Blumenthal is facing a serious race, and the Democrats establishment is plowing money into his race against a Republican, Leora Levy. I mean, these are about as safe places as can be for Democrats. So if you see movement there, you see resources being plowed into these places, I think it's very bullish for Republicans. It would seem to illustrate that, kind of the bread and butter issues of, are you poorer? Are you less safe? Do you feel like your kids are under assault, getting a bad education, being indoctrinated? That actually has moved people. That bump on abortion, I think, has not played out. It's probably netted out to nothing because you have pro-life people who are animated on the issue. You have the pro-abortion people who are animated on the issue. And in many states, it's pretty polarized one way or the other anyway, at least in the places that are most passionate about it. So it's probably not going to show up ultimately in the kind of median states. The last thing I'd say is, what can we expect from Republicans? I'm much more bullish on what happens in terms of the House and the Senate than I am in terms of the substance of what a Republican House and or total Congress might look like. I did see that Kevin McCarthy put out a statement basically saying he's going to de-link border security from some kind of pathway to citizenship or DACA. His direct quote is, I believe Biden's destroyed our border so badly, you can't tie the two. You've just got to fix the border to start out before you can deal with immigration. I think this qualifies, I guess, as a win pre-midterms. Let's see what happens post-midterms. But I think the best we can expect, I have very low expectations here, will be that the Republicans will block the worst impulses of the Democrat Party and Joe Biden, and maybe we'll have some bombshell hearings where there are revelations that come out. But I'm less bullish in terms of the substance of what a Republican Congress will actually look like.
So a couple of things that have been interesting in the last couple of weeks. You can tell Democrats are flailing by how they're just flinging abortion at everything. And this is twofold. One, I think they're flailing, but two, abortion is their religion and they don't know how to turn from it. But it's how you get just unbelievable interviews like the one with Stacey Abrams. I think it was on MSNBC yesterday, where they were like, how do you solve the economic, woes facing everyday Americans? And she basically, the distillation of what she said was basically abort your child. Right? Like, well, the reason people are having economic problems is because they have unplanned pregnancies. That was sort of the actual way she said it. I saw the Babylon Bee riffed it and said the way to solve all your bills is to kill yourself. Right? That's like the conclusion of what she's saying. So the answer to everything because they have no actual answer, they're just responding with abortion politics. But there was another interesting poll, taking what Emily said about the polling industry being sort of intellectually bankrupt, but what we have to work with. There was a New York Times Siena poll that came out this week, interestingly showing that 45% of Americans regard Trump as a threat to democracy, but only 28% say the same about Republicans, and actually 33% view the Democrat Party as a threat to democracy, which I kind of think is interesting because that's a total repudiation of the way in which Democrats have run this race, which is to try to paint every Republican candidate as somehow a giant fascist in waiting, right? And they're going to upend democracy. And so maybe that's a silver lining. I always come back to the fact that voters are constantly smarter than people give them credit for. So it's positive to see them rejecting that. And I hope it's a trend that continues. But if that does, then I think, to Emily's point, we are going to see the polls be repudiated in some respect, and potentially Republicans outperforming what we've seen if people are just rejecting the messaging from Democratic Party. So
let's transition to Emily, but I'll use my moderator's prerogative to add a very, very final capstone on this, which is I saw a poll earlier this week that even on the abortion issue that Democrats are running so hard on, there's one poll I saw that by a roughly 2-to-1 margin, voters told the poll that Democrats were more extreme and out of touch on that very issue that they pretend to be kind of like their holy grail than Republicans. So even on their one issue, they seem to be flailing. But let's send it over to Emily to talk about John Oliver.
Well, I'm so glad actually that you added that point, Josh, because it's exactly where we're going with this next segment. Now, John Oliver ran a 26-minute repudiation or attempted repudiation of basically bigotry, rank bigotry that he sees coming from the Republican Party and the many people across party lines that now oppose the extremism of transgender ideology as it has been implemented into curricula for kids as young as 4 years old with taxpayer money through high school and then into college in ways that plenty of non-Republicans are panicking about the dangers of, because young women are coming out more and more and more saying how it has hurt them, how they were basically the effects of this experiment that was run in real time. They were the guinea pigs, and the results are not good. So John Oliver comes in, runs this 26-minute segment. He doesn't have, a massive audience. I think Greg Gutfeld probably has a much bigger audience than he does at this point, but he does have a big audience on YouTube. His probably the big chunk of HBO's business strategy right now is Oliver's viral videos on YouTube, and that's really important because it lives forever there. It's not just sort of broadcast on the show and then goes along, but John Oliver on YouTube is a pretty big presence. And so there was the segment went fairly viral. It was in John Oliver's typical smug and contemptuous and know-it-all approach to this, to rebutting what he sees as bigotry. But of course, he was actually the one that was very, very wrong, and was giving cover for people that bigots. It was not funny at all. And it's certainly not funny if you spend much time listening to the stories of people whose bodies have been mutilated while they were still while their brains are still developing, and where in fact there is irreversible damage being done, at the very least on a scale that we don't know yet how bad it would be. So John Oliver had the audacity to do his usual shtick, condescending to and criticizing and implicitly calling people bigots, basically for not wanting some of this stuff to happen. And I want to read a segment to the point Josh just made from a post on Colin Wright's Substack that really debunked a lot of the bad science. I mean, Oliver kind of comes in and cherry picks research and does that sort of typical. We saw Jon Stewart do it with Leslie Rutledge in an interview just a couple of weeks ago, trying to say, well, we have all of the data on our side. It sounds like the climate debate. All of the scientists agree with X, Y, and Z, and your studies are just cherry picked and nonsense. And that's really what the segment was about in large part. But Colin Wright's Substack gets into this, and it sort of lists off some of the things that Republicans have done, and then has a graph where it says, the Democrats, on the other hand, have passed laws that allow children to medically transition without parental consent, sent CPS after parents who don't socially or medically affirm their trans-identified kids, and attempted to criminalize parents who refuse pediatric gender medical interventions. I think it's safe to call these actions on both sides, quote, effing insane, which is a term Oliver uses several times, but never for Democrats. And that is just an absolutely huge piece of this puzzle. The Substack goes on to say, it's weird that such assertions are swept away as wrongthink because, yeah, a lot of people on the left are worried about the compelled speech of pronoun announcements, and that the left's handling of this issue may cost us the election, and with it, our democracy. Why not take that seriously? Okay, so with all of that, I want to toss it open to the group because it's a very, very, very good point that John Oliver and the Jon Stewarts of the world, the sort of smug liberals, who previously used to be sort of the ACLU liberals, right? Like the civil libertarians who took this stuff very seriously, are now sort of coming in to try and change the debate. They've seen that the left is losing. They've seen that more and more people from both sides of the aisle are coming in and saying like, hey, we need to pause because this is basically an experiment that's going awry, and it's hurting real children. They're coming in now with their nonsense that does remind me a lot of the climate change debate, and I think it's going to backfire. And I think exactly for the reasons that blog post or the Substack post on Colin Wright's page mentions, like these are very legitimate concerns. They're bipartisan legitimate concerns, and you cannot silence the victims that are increasingly, I think, visible in our culture. So I'll toss it open to the group with that.
I think it's absolutely true that this is becoming more visible, and the stakes and perils of this, are vastly clearer than they were even a year ago. But what concerns me about this issue is that it's such a lock on elite groupthink, right? It's a case study, and this is just horrific, and the victims are telling their stories publicly, and yet you still have this group of people at the top of the social class, the top of the medical class, which I think is even more concerning, saying that this is good, and anyone who questions it is bigots. And I think I read somewhere too, I honestly can't remember because I'm tired, but because my kid doesn't sleep. But there was someone who made this point, which I thought was very good, which is that how it's always framed is an LGBTQ issue, but the LGB is doing a lot of work for the T, when in reality, this is just about the trans issue. It's not about the rest of the movement. So they try to cobble it all into like, oh, you just hate, everybody in this movement if you don't support trans rights. When increasingly, even people in the LGB categories are turning against this and saying there might be a problem here. So I do hope that the tide is turning, but I also think that this is a case study of elite groupthink, which history has shown is often hard to shake.
So I guess I have two things that I want to say in this segment. So one thing is, I can't remember if we discussed it on this podcast. I don't think we did, but there was this remarkable kind of mini parental revolt in what is one of the most Muslim towns in the United States, Dearborn, Michigan, a little over a week ago. And if I can make a shameless plug, we've now published two excellent op-eds on this at Newsweek, one from Suraj Hashimi and one from Max Eden. And they both kind of just talk about the fact that the left is just totally they are overplaying their hand on this issue. They are radically overplaying their hand on this issue. And you don't need to just go to Michigan, obviously. I'm right here in Florida where I live, obviously. I mean, the whole DeSantis Disney fight, which we have discussed ad infinitum on this particular podcast, that fight was largely on just the indoctrination of gender ideology. And this issue it is increasingly obvious through all these various anecdotal data points that the left, their stance is not nearly as popular as they think it is. And, if I could encourage the listeners and viewers to check out, I think Max Eden's op-ed for us at Newsweek in particular, he basically, when Max did in this article, he just kind of, he quotes, he watched a full 3 hours of video from this particular school board meeting. And he just quotes paragraph-long quotes from these various parents who happen to be traditional Muslims who do not fit, obviously, like the Trump MAGA, white nationalist, Christian nationalist stereotype. And these are people, that are basically, that in Dearborn, they were basically listening to a prominent imam who actually encouraged them to go to this meeting to protest this transgender pornography, just general kind of just sexual indoctrination. So it's really interesting stuff. The only other quick point that I want to make, though, is that if I can tie kind of the last segment to this one, I think it is incumbent upon Republicans not to take the wrong lessons away from the 2022 midterms if it does indeed go as well as I think it does. And what I mean by that is it does appear to be, the old Jimmy Carville line, it's the economy, stupid. A lot of voters are going to vote on the economy and inflation, to a lesser extent, perhaps crime and maybe immigration. But Republicans cannot forget and should not forget the centrality of the so-called culture war issues, because, as much as kind of the leftist economic inflation, money printing, Federal Reserve, blah, 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 as much as that playbook is total gobbledygook, it really is these cultural issues where they are just totally radically overstepping their hand. And as far as just meaningful wins in the ballot box, Republicans think would be remiss to take away the wrong lessons, or at least to kind of over extrapolate the lessons if they cruise to victory in early November on economic issues.
So I would also commend our listeners, viewers, to a couple pieces. Lior Sapir has a piece at City Journal where he just completely destroys John Oliver's entire critique. Well worth reading. And then Peachy Keenan has a piece, it's pseudonymous Peachy Keenan has a piece over at American Mind. I think it's titled something like, It Takes a Village to Take Your Child. And I think it lays out very clearly the stakes when it comes to quote unquote gender affirming care, which ranges from, encouraging people by using their preferred pronouns all the way to genital mutilation and double mastectomies. Well worth reading on that. I think one of the points worth highlighting on this issue, besides the fact that it's very revealing about the left, that some of the left, and granted, there is blowback from liberals and leftists, and even people who would call themselves pro-LGBT on this particular issue. So they're really destroying their own tenuous alliance here, as reflected in Dearborn, but also as reflected in some of the backlash they're facing to quote unquote gender affirming care. What does this say about the nature of the left in terms of trying to create wedges between parents and their children, the assault on parental rights, then the fact that they're willing to use children as experiments here when there is by far not even close to a medical consensus on this issue, despite what the medical establishment is saying? I do think it represents also tactically that you have a whole of regime effort here in terms of blue state executives. The Biden administration, which is using its Justice Department to go after states which dare dissent on this issue, going after Eagle Forum of Alabama in a very chilling way, with a subpoena essentially asking for all of their lobbying efforts around the bill in Alabama, which is currently being litigated over by the federal government. DOJ brought suit, or was a party to the suit there, on Alabama's anti-gender affirming care, so-called policy. But the states here are really a bulwark. And I think this issue in particular really reflects how critical the states are, which I guess is sort of a heartening thing, given that the federal Leviathan, it's sort of assumed, has taken over everything, controls via the power of the purse. But here, states really can make a difference. They can be sanctuaries for sanity. And yet you also have a state like California, first of its kind sanctuary state for those children seeking quote unquote gender affirming care and protection from their parents against it. This is leading to a very Orwellian, disturbing place. Thank God there are some states that are sane, but I think this is a burgeoning battle, and we're going to see it accelerate in years to come. So this is kind of the first word, I think, on this backlash and the battle that's going on here, but it's certainly not going to be the last.
All right, so let's transition to Rachel to take us home by talking about what's happening across the pond in the UK.
Yeah, so we were recording this on Thursday morning, and just this morning, you had Liz Truss step down as prime minister. I think the shortest time in office of any prime minister in history. The Daily Star in the UK had an ongoing timeline saying, will this head of lettuce outlast Liz Truss? And at the end of the day, the head of lettuce won. So unfortunately for her, but I think this is an interesting case study and one worth reviewing. So you had Liz Truss kind of step up in the midst of, turmoil in Britain, similar but slightly different to what we're facing, a massive energy crisis put forward by what's going on in Ukraine. You have a failing national health system, their infrastructure is collapsing, and then general inflationary, disasters that I think a lot of Western countries are dealing with. So you had Liz Truss step into that gap, and sort of instead of putting forward a lot, some short-term solutions designed to stem the bleeding of very basic, functional government actions that people would need to see right now. She puts forward a budget that I believe is $48 billion in unfunded tax cuts. They're supposed to be catalyzing economic growth, right? She said, they'll pay for themselves via economic growth. And what we saw was the complete opposite. The markets responded by completely crashing. The Bank of England had to step in to save pensions. You saw mortgages about to rise on 5 million families, just complete collapse of her plan, essentially. And again, you are dealing with people in Britain facing basic issues like being able to eat and heat their homes and find shelter in the winter. You have Liz Truss walking up to the microphone saying, what will solve this? Tax cuts for the rich. So I think what's interesting here is it reflects all of the tensions we're dealing with here in the United States, which is, again, she's running on sort of Thatcher era economics, where a lot of Republican politicians here in the United States are running on Reagan era, Ryan era economics, putting that playbook on a completely different set of conditions. And Aris Rusenaus over at Unheard had, I think, a beautiful way of framing it. And I'm going to quote from his article from earlier this month called Liz Truss Has Betrayed Conservatism. He says, quote, "We've been foisted with a career politician who seems to view the laziest left-wing caricatures of Toryism as a political roadmap, a pure zealot of unrestrained capital with no vision of the good beyond libertarian think tank pamphlets and a burning faith in the might and power of the market's invisible hand. Alas, Truss's faith in the markets is not rewarded by the market's faith in her. The invisible hand has already reached down to flick her from the history books." And end quote. I think that is just sort of a perfect encapsulation of what's going on here. He later goes on in a different piece to say, the ideologues have crashed the Conservative Party and Britain into a cliff. And I think that's accurate. And so I think there's a couple of things worth learning from this. The first thing is that, in this climate of upheaval, the focus on long-term growth isn't necessarily the thing here, right? The focus on the GDP when people can't heat their homes isn't solving the problem. And so I think for the next 10 years, if things are going to be as sort of economically rocky and the global order is shifting under our feet, this focus from right-leaning politicians on the link between economic growth and GDP is going to have to be severed. Slow-term growth and a focus on building up the nation for what's about to come, I think has to be where we focus as a matter of economics. It's unfortunate that we've ended up here. It's unfortunate that we spent the last 20 years diminishing our state capacity to deal with where we now sit, but this is where we are. And the second thing I would say, is that there are some lessons here for Republican politicians. And the analogy isn't perfect, but I want to link it to something Kevin McCarthy said this week, which is he told in an interview with Punchbowl News, talking about the upcoming debt limit crisis, not crisis, but it will invariably be a crisis. Congress is going to have to decide whether or not to raise the debt limit. McCarthy says, okay, this is a leverage point. I'm going to enter into this debate, and I'm going to be pushing for spending cuts. I'm going to be pushing for potentially entitlement reform. He didn't say this, but when asked, are you going to deal with entitlements? He said he didn't rule it out. And I just think, how it's framed is going to be very important, because I think the Republican Party runs the risk of running into a Truss situation if they are handed back power and the first thing they do is, talk about sort of high level fiscal issues. Not to say that the debt isn't a problem. We are in an inflation crisis, I would argue, because we've overspent vastly. And I think a way in which potentially to frame this is to deal with the massive amounts of money sloshing around in the economy. Maybe we say, okay, we're going to pull back a lot of the just billions of dollars that states are just sitting on, right? Maybe we can claw that back. That would be a reasonable way to talk about this. But to go in and say, we're going to reform Social Security, and we're going to attack Medicare, that I think we'd walk into a rhetorical situation that Truss has sort of the corner she's backed herself into. And I think that speaks to the broader situation that, look, Republicans have to shed their Ryan era economic fixation when you have Americans being threatened with being debanked, when the DOJ is arresting political dissidents in the streets, when you cannot speak into the public space. So these are all things I think we can learn from the Truss debacle. If there's a silver lining to it at all, perhaps it is the accelerationist end of it, right? Okay, now we can actually see how these ideas in practice aren't working with these market conditions that we now face. And going forward, as the global order is being reshaped, we need to focus on national resilience. So I'll open it up to y'all. I mean, this was a very fluid situation that we just learned about today, so I'm interested in hearing your takes.
So I think that was really helpful. That was really excellent, kind of laying out of the lay of the land, Rachel. I think the broader 35,000 foot altitude view is in a lot of Western and Western style societies, you're seeing the dwindling, in some cases, perhaps even kind of the near outright collapse of these traditional, more venerable, you might say, kind of center right parties at the expense of these rising kind of more national conservative, national populist aligned kind of right wing parties. So the Tories have, been descending for many years now. The Tories couldn't make up their mind which way they were going to be on Brexit. David Cameron, who was the Tory prime minister from 2010 to 2015, 2016, something like that. He famously kind of ultimately acceded to holding a referendum on Brexit, but he was a defiant Remainer. He wanted the UK to remain in Brexit. And, that level of disconnect between what the Tory establishment had and what the median Tory voter, really just the median kind of British nationalist, frankly, wanted, saw the rise of figures like Nigel Farage and UKIP and the Brexit Party and things like that. In Israel, to like a slightly lesser extent, Likud, which is still kind of the biggest party in their own parliamentary system, has still nonetheless been losing some voters over the past decade or two to some smaller kind of right-wing parties. The upcoming Israeli election on November 1st, we'll see how strong that trend is. But as of right now, it looks like some smaller parties like Smotrich and Ben Gavir's parties are polling quite well. We'll see if that holds up. So, the problem from kind of an American new right, so to speak, perspective is we live in a two-party system, right? I mean, that is kind of like the fundamental difference between the U.S. political system at like the broadest level and there's various other parliamentary systems, the UK, Israel, Australia, whatever, that have, a much easier time with these smaller parties kind of gaining momentum. So what Rachel said really is the problem. I mean, the problem is, we need to make sure that the GOP moving forward does not over extrapolate, to go back to what I was saying on the last segment, from their what seems to be an impending victory on economic issues, and then just revert to dead consensus Romney-Ryan economics. I mean, that would be an unmitigated disaster I'm not sure how strongly I could phrase that. It would be a truly, truly unmitigated disaster for the American right and for the American republic in general there. And I just hope that some folks are paying attention to this historic collapse of Liz Truss and draw the right lessons from that.
So I would just make one brief economic point and then one observation. The economic point is that economic growth itself is a function of the people operating in the marketplace. And that's, it's a truism. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't have a thriving people, and a thriving people relies on strong families, strong socializing, civilizing institutions with proper values and principles, you're not going to ultimately have that economic growth in the first place. The economy is a function of the people, not the other way around, even though economies can influence people. And so I think it's just an important point to make, that in terms of what the right policy set is going forward, and clearly all of these Western governments are being repudiated in one way or another with the populist nationalist challenges to them, it comes down to, how do you make a thriving people? And everything else flows from that. The other observation I'll make is, we seem to be transitioning into, certainly on a relative basis, a high interest rate world. We'd been in a world of declining interest rates in the West for 40 years. Interest rates themselves bake in a lot of information about the state of a civilization. Certainly, it doesn't augur positive things when they're rapidly rising. But in this case, perhaps those economic indicators and economic influences will have a positive influence, because a high interest rate world which we're entering is going to have manifest implications on a whole slew of issues for governments, the biggest debtors of them all, for people and beyond. And I think we ought to start looking out at the horizon in terms of what those implications are. They will probably coincide with many of the themes that we try to emphasize every single week here as being antidotes going forward.
Just quickly, I would say this idea that we're departing from some sort of free market utopia is kind of funny, because the reason this sort of, as Rachel said in the intro, orthodoxies aren't entirely applicable, or maybe justly applicable right now, are because there never really were free market orthodoxies. You had tax cuts, sure, but with like incredible spending elsewhere, without ever really cutting entitlements, without ever really dealing with the so-called free trade system. And so it's just like ridiculous to want to stick so firmly to, because I believe that we need to cut entitlements desperately. And I think probably all of us agree with that. Timing is a different question, but this is not sustainable. It's absolutely not sustainable. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. But this idea that if we don't address it right at this very, very moment, it all collapses. It's like, that's been the case for 30 years. Well, you spend $1 million, in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's a ridiculous sort of idea about what can and cannot be done that is informed pretty much entirely by big money and special interests that are chirping in the ears of establishment Republicans and getting them to think that this is the sort of principled approach. And with that, I'll turn it over to Josh, who I imagine will turn it over to final thoughts.
Well, Emily took the words out of my mouth. So let's go to final thoughts. Does anyone want to get us started? All right. If not, go ahead, Beck. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say really briefly, going back to the opening segment, and this implicates obviously what a Republican Congress would look like. I think an ideal church committee for the new age, first of all, we ought to be having a conversation right now about who are the right personnel to be leading such a committee, and some of them may be outside of Congress members, and maybe there would be like an alternative church committee outside that's also informing the one that's on the inside. But in addition to that, what is the mandate? What is the mission? And ultimately, it has to have legislative remedies with real serious teeth put forth. And what we have to be thinking about in terms of staffing it, and also what the ultimate scope of it is how do you insulate that committee from the pressures of a national security apparatus that, if it really feels threatened, will go scorched earth against any and all individuals associated with it. It's a very important issue. It's a critical issue. And you have to have people with serious intestinal fortitude willing to do what's right for the country in taking on an apparatus that has become totally unaccountable which the Durham special counsel, I think, sadly, has perfectly revealed to all of us.
So I will go in a slightly different direction, but it actually relates to kind of the past 2 or 3 segments, kind of economics centricity. So this Wednesday, I flew up to North Carolina to give like a guest, like 35-40 minute lecture for a Duke Econ 101 course, because I was actually a Duke Econ major in a previous life. And it was a little different than kind of the normal campus speaking I do. It was like half substantive, half kind of like how economics has informed my career and so forth. But the point that I made, which really kind of directly kind of gets at what Emily was just talking about when it comes to kind of the right not abandoning, so-called laissez-faire or free market economics or whatever. The point that I kind of made when I kind of got to the portion of my talk that was more about kind of the new right and classical liberalism. There's a very interesting blog post at Tyler Cowen's Marginal Revolution blog this week by Tyler Cowen himself, talking about kind of this intellectual and economic divide between kind of the so-called classical liberalism camp and the so-called new right camp. The point that I made to the Econ 101 students who are predominantly freshmen, kind of just learning about like supply and demand curves and deadweight loss and growth and Keynes and all this stuff for the first time. The basic point that I made is that the models generally hold as far as neoclassical economics and efficiency maximization are concerned. So put another way, when you're looking at a supply and demand curve, when you're looking at kind of taxation, when you're looking at subsidization, the basic ideas of deadweight loss, of opportunity costs, none of that is bogus. I mean, those concepts apply. But here's the key point. Here is kind of the key point, I think, and this is, I think, kind of one of the leading distinctions between kind of the 3 cheers for capitalism, what Orrin Cass would call the free market fundamentalists, kind of the laissez-faire extremists, what I referred to in my speech in Steubenville recently as kind of the zombie Hayekians. The key distinction between kind of the 3 cheers for capitalism absolutist camp and the kind of 2 cheers for capitalism that I think is kind of more of kind of like the NatCon or national populist perspective is that I think we understand that we elect political leaders not to simply take economic efficiency maximization and then to kind of put it into a one input algorithm where the one output is economics. Put another way, we elect politicians who, at least in theory, and obviously not always in practice, at least in theory, are trained in kind of the virtues and the ancients and their Cicero and their Aristotle. And they are basically able to take various inputs from the economists, from the sociologists, from the anthropologists, from the scientists, from the doctors, and basically try to kind of then put an output that is oriented fundamentally to human flourishing and the common good. This was also obviously one of the leading flaws of President Biden, and I hate to say, as well, President Trump, at least kind of earlier in the pandemic, when they were just basically kind of just spewing out whatever Fauci and Burke and the COVID committee were saying as national policy. I mean, the left likes to say, trust the science, the capital S science, but no, we don't elect politicians to simply implement the science, the same way that we don't elect politicians to simply implement the capital E economics. So it's a very important distinction to make. I mean, it's kind of a rudimentary basic distinction. I mean, at least when I spoke at Duke, it seemed to resonate a little bit with the freshmen. They kind of, I think, understood what I was getting at there. But that is really what we're talking about fundamentally here, when we're talking about kind of not over extrapolating kind of the lessons from the economics in the 2022 midterms, the Liz Truss stuff. Even if kind of austerity measures and kind of, mass spending cuts and mass tax cuts, even if a lot of this looks good on an economics 101 chalkboard, doesn't necessarily always mean that it's going to be the best public policy implemented by a particular politician at a particular time in a particular setting.
I once speaking of economists, I once heard a quote that I just think sums up so much of our modern economics, which is, an economist is someone who sees an idea working in practice and asks to see it in theory. Like that is, I think, just kind of the moment, but it sums up to me the moment that we're living in right now with sort of like the Truss debacle, which is, and you're already seeing people say this on Twitter, particularly at AEI and some other think tanks. Well, real free market economics hasn't been tried, and that's why Liz Truss is failing, because, we need to stick with our principles. And it's like, guys, we also have to deal in reality. And to the point Emily made, like, yes, our entitlements are going to crash at some point. Like, we're going to be insolvent. Our debt is a huge problem. But the thing is, we've made a lot of choices or not made the right ones that have led us to this point where we are just woefully unprepared to do all of this now. And, when that was the biggest threat, we didn't deal with it. And now it's a threat, but it's been, I think, outmoded by bigger threats that we're facing. And I would add to that the fact that, all of the sort of global conditions that made it possible for us to ignore the housing crisis, Medicare insolvency, the debt, all of the conditions that made it possible for us to ignore that have now come to fruition, and we are facing a global order sea change, right? Like, we are talking about the crack up of the neoliberal system. And it's interesting because the piece that Josh mentioned, the Tyler Cowen critique of the new right vis-a-vis classical liberalism, I think is actually very fair.
Yeah.
But the part he doesn't deal with is the fact that our libertarian economics, which infuses most of the right at this point, was completely captured by the neoliberal order that is now over. And he doesn't deal with that, right? Sorry, go ahead, Emily. You look like you can say something.
Well, no, I didn't know if you were done, because I was going to transition to my final thought right after that.
I can be done. That's okay.
Can you, though? Are you
Well,
ever done?
More of an existential question, but yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to say, actually, it's a perfect point, because you know what the libertarian economics did? They created these more pressing problems, like the fact that we have tons and tons of young girls that are being caught, as we talked about earlier. Like, is it exactly their fault? No, but it is this downstream consequence of creating these crony, big, huge institutions that now have so much power. Think about Facebook, think about Twitter, think of if they didn't have the concentrated power over our speech that they did, how much more difficult it would have been for the left to normalize some of these ideas about sex, gender, and race. How much about these sort of confines of speech that have created huge problems in our culture. They were pushing NAFTA, they were pushing WTO, they were hollowing out communities that are still not recovering, and there are a lot of people who are culturally gravitating towards populism that make something like Donald Trump possible when everybody else is sort of so worried about propriety. They're looking for a vehicle of destruction, and that is because of the sort of myopia of neoliberal economics. And that's essential to sort of understand when you're going into a potential new Republican Congress, because it does make it sound, or it does make it puts in context this question of like, what should be number one on the agenda. We now have to deal with those. We have to band-aid up the problems that we're downstream of, the sort of myopic economics. So that's my final thought.
All right. Well, on that note, on behalf of Rachel, Ben, and Emily, I'm Josh Hammer. We will see you at the next NatCon Squad.